Before we can look at monetary policy, we need to understand money supply and money demanded. So let's start with the supply of money. And we're going to look at the supply of money in terms of M1. So think back to the previous level. What was M1? M1 included cash, right? Banknotes, coins, and it included demand deposits, money in your checking account. So let's look at what would change the supply of money. Well, in the previous level, we talked about how you can increase the money supply. So what are those 4 ways you could increase the money supply? Right? We could print more. So we could mint more coins. We could issue more banknotes. How else can we increase the money supply? We can change the bank rate, right? And what was the bank rate? The bank rate was the rate at which federally chartered banks could borrow from the Bank of Canada. So we could change that bank rate, and that changes the amount of money that your bank gets access to, because it changes how costly it is for them to borrow from the Bank of Canada. We could also change the overnight target rate. The overnight target rate, okay, is the rate at which banks borrow from each other. Okay. So again, changing the access that banks have in terms of cash, because the more cash they have, the more cash gets lent out, and that creates more money supply. So changing the bank rate and the overnight target rate change bank lending. We can also change the reserve requirement. Okay. And so the reserve requirement, you'll recall, is the amount of cash that banks have to keep on hand. It's the excess reserve that they can lend out, and the target reserve is what they have to keep as cash. So if the Bank of Canada changes the reserve requirement, raises the reserve, then banks have less money to lend out, and it's bank lending that increases the money supply. We also have quantitative easing as another way to increase the money supply, equivalent to printing more, really. In that case, the federal government could issue a bond, or corporations could issue bonds, and the Bank of Canada buys them by essentially creating electronic money. So it's a way to get more money out in circulation without having to physically print it. Instead, we're creating electronic money out of nothing, and that's why it's ex nihilo money, out of nothing. So we can increase the money supply by printing more, changing the bank rates and overnight target rates, changing the reserve requirements. So all of these decisions are made by the Bank of Canada independent of what the prime rate is. So we talk about printing more money, or changing the bank rate, or the overnight target rate, or the reserve requirement. We're changing the money supply regardless of the level of the prime rate. And so when you graph the money supply, it's actually a vertical line because it doesn't depend on the interest rate. The Bank of Canada could decide to print more money regardless of what interest rates have. And commercial banks, which set prime rates, they don't have to lower the prime rate, even though the Bank of Canada lowers the bank rate and the overnight target rate. Now, typically, banks do raise their prime rate when the bank rate and the overnight target rate go up, because if it's more costly for them to borrow, it's going to be more costly for you to borrow. But they don't have to. And so when we graph the money supply, it's a vertical line because it does not depend on the prime rate or other interest rates. So now let's look at the demand for money. When it comes to the demand for money, there are different types of demand for money. And it ties back to what are the purposes of money. So if we think back to the previous level, we need our money to do 3 things. It needs to be a medium of exchange. That is, other businesses and people accept it in exchange for goods and services. It needs to be a store of wealth. That is, it's a way for us to accumulate wealth so that we can spend money later. So you need a way to kind of stockpile it so you can buy more stuff in the future. And the last one was unit of account. This allows us to know how much things are worth by putting a dollar value on it. So we know how much a truck is versus a Snickers bar, and so on. So money is a medium of exchange, a store of wealth, and a unit of account. When we look at the demand for money, our demand for money is related to the purposes of money. The first demand for money we're going to look at is a transaction demand. And transaction demand is the demand for money to use it as a medium of exchange. So that is, you demand more cash so you can buy more stuff. So when do you demand more cash? Well, you demand more cash if your income has gone up, right? If you get an increase in your paycheck, you get a bonus, then you're going to want to have more cash on hand so that you can spend that increase in income. So a change in income is going to increase your demand for M1. So is a change in price levels. So if goods are now more expensive, you're going to need more cash to buy the same stuff. So in order to buy those things, to use money as a medium of exchange, you're going to have more transaction demand. You're going to demand more cash so you can pay that more expensive price for things. Okay? So whenever there's a change in real income or a change in price levels, it's going to shift the transaction demand for money. So when we graph the transaction demand for money, our desire to hold money to buy things is independent of the interest rate, right? When you go to the grocery store to buy dinner, you don't care what the interest rate is. The amount of cash you're going to need on hand to buy those groceries depends on how much income you have and how much those groceries cost. It doesn't relate to interest rates. And so the transaction demand for money is a vertical line. When you have more income, or when prices go up, that transaction demand for money shifts to the right. The second type of demand for money is what is called the asset demand for money. So asset demand for money relates to money being a store of wealth. So we need a way to accumulate our funds so we can buy more in the future. And this does depend on the interest rate. Okay, so M1, money in cash, and money in demand deposits doesn't accumulate interest, right? It's money in your savings account, notice deposits, that accumulate or earn interest. It's M3, so money that you put into mutual funds and government bonds, those types of things, those earn a rate of interest. So when we look at asset demand, we're looking at the desire to hold money, M1, that's cash or money in your checking account. So the amount of money you're going to hold as cash will change depending on what interest rates are if you want to have your money be a store of wealth. That is, you can buy more stuff in the future. So let's look at this. Let's suppose the interest rates are high. Okay, so if we're at a high level of interest rate, then how would you rather hold your money so that you can buy more stuff in the future? Would you rather hold it as cash, right? Stick it under your mattress, put it in a piggy bank? Or would you rather store your money in terms of money in a savings account that earns interest, or buy mutual funds, or invest in government bonds? You'd rather have it not be M1 because M1 doesn't earn you any interest. If interest rates are high and you want to accumulate more wealth to buy things in the future, then you want to hold less M1, right? You're going to switch to forms of money that will earn that high rate of interest. If interest rates are low, so let's just write this down. Interest rate is high, the quantity of M1 goes down, And when interest rates are low, what happens to the quantity of M1 that you want to hold? Well, if interest rates are low, so your money that you put into M2 or M3 are not earning you much of a return, then you might as well turn it into cash and spend it. Turn it into cars and art and houses. You might as well put your money there instead of into a savings account that's not earning you very much money. So when interest rates are low, the quantity of M1 will increase. There's no point in putting money into an interest-earning savings account. You might as well turn it into cash and spend it. So what we find then is the asset demand for money is downward sloping. At high levels of interest, M1 is low, and at low levels of interest, M1 is higher. So when we add together the asset demand and the transaction demand, what we get is an overall demand for money that is downward sloping. Okay? Remember, the transaction demand for money is independent of interest rates, but the asset demand for money changes with the interest rate. So our overall demand for money is going to be downward sloping as well. So then as we look at the total demand for money, changing the rate of interest moves you along the demand curve. It's only changing the level of transactions, okay, so how much income you have, because that's going to mean you're going to buy more stuff. Or if you change the value of those transactions, that is the price of things, only those two are going to shift the demand for money. Okay, so the level of transactions, and since we're looking at not just an individual's income, but everyone's income, we're looking at real GDP. And then the prices of goods start to change. We're going to need more cash to buy things, so a change in the price level. So these two will shift the demand for money. A change in the interest rate moves us just along the graph. So now let's combine the demand for money and the supply of money and start to look at how they relate to each other. All right, so here we have the money supply. It's a vertical line. Remember, it doesn't depend on the prime rate. It's because the Bank of Canada can simply print more cash. And we have a downward sloping demand for money, and that's because the asset demand for money is downward sloping, and we add that to a transaction demand, which is a vertical line, and we end up with downward sloping. So let's look at what happens if, for example, we are at a high rate of interest. All right, so let's say the interest rate is high. If the interest rate is high, so at interest rate that's high, okay, what happens? Well, at a high interest rate, the money supplied is more than the money demanded. So that is, we have more access to more cash than we need. So money demanded, right? That's our ability to buy things. And so if the money supply is more than money demanded, we have more cash than we want to buy stuff. So what do you do with this surplus, all this extra money that's more than you want to buy? Well, at high rates of interest, you're going to take that money and you're going to invest it, right? So you're going to do things like buy bonds. You might as well take all of that M1 that's more than you need and turn it into something that's going to earn you interest, accumulate some wealth for you. Let's try this here. Okay. Now, so we have to consider the relationship between the money market and the bond market. Okay. When it comes to bonds, so if we think about how bonds work, you buy a bond at a certain price. Okay, and then over a period of time, that bond earns interest. And at a fixed maturity date, it's going to have a specific value. In the bond market, where we have demand for bonds and supply of bonds, the price of the bonds can change. Now, if you change the price of bonds, so for example, if the price of bonds go up, then the rate of the return, the interest the bond earned, goes down. Because at maturity, the bond has a fixed value that doesn't change. If the price of bonds go down, then the interest earned on the bond increases, so it can still maintain that same fixed value at maturity. Okay, so let's go back to our money market. Well, our money market says I have more cash than I want to spend. So I have a surplus of cash. So I need to put it into some kind of investment that will earn me that high interest, because M1 doesn't earn me any interest. Well, so what happens? Well, I demand more in the bond market. And when there's more demand in the bond market, what happens to the prices of bonds? Well, the bond market works like every other market with demand and supply, and that increase in demand drives up the price. So if we all want to buy bonds, the price of bonds goes up. Well, what does that do to the rate of return on bonds? Well, since they have a fixed value at maturity, if the price you sell the bond for goes up, then the amount of interest they earn goes down. And so what happens is all these interests earning investments, whether you're talking about bonds or other types of investments, as we start to switch all of our money from cash to these other investments, the interest rates start to fall, okay, until they get back here to equilibrium. Well, what if we have low interest rates? At low interest rates, so at an interest rate that's low, what we have is we have our money demanded is more than money supplied. So at low interest rates, remember, we would rather have our money in terms of cash, because if it's not going to earn the interest, we might as well buy assets, right? Buy cars and houses and things that help us accumulate wealth. So here, the money demanded is more than the money supplied. So there's a shortage of cash. Okay? If there's a shortage of cash, what happens? Well, if there's not enough cash to buy the things we want, then what happens is we start taking money out of our other investments, things that were earning interest. So we cash out the mutual funds. We pull money out of the savings account. Well, when you do that, if we look at the bond market, for example, if we all start to sell our bonds because we want to turn it into cash because we don't have enough cash to buy the stuff we want, we sell the bonds, and that puts downward pressure on the price of bonds. Right? We go from this price to this price goes down. As the price of bonds go down, what must happen to the interest rate, the amount that the bonds earn? Well, remember, they have a fixed value at maturity. Fixed value at maturity. Okay, so if the price goes down, the return on the bonds must go up in order for them to meet that fixed value after a period of time. So what happens is if interest rates are low, we start pulling our money out of those investments that aren't earning us the rate of return we had wanted, and we might as well turn into cash to buy stuff. Well, if we pull all our money out of the investments, then that means the rate of return on those investments starts to climb, and we end back up at equilibrium. So if interest rates are too high, we switch from cash to other investments, and interest rates fall. And if interest rates are too low, we pull out of those investments and we switch to cash, and that makes interest rates go up. So we end up here at equilibrium. And we need to understand then what happens to this equilibrium as we start to change the money supply, the money demanded, and ultimately what happens when we start using monetary policy.